Every night, regardless of the weather, there is a faint whistling sound coming from somewhere down our street. It always begins at precisely 3:03 and is only audible if you are in the kitchen or living room when they pass. Somewhere toward the beginning of the alley, close to the Carson residence, the sound begins softly. The whistling passes us and then fades away into the cul-de-sac, since we are getting closer to the middle of the street. On other evenings when I was younger, my sister and I would slip into the kitchen to listen. Since we always followed the one big rule, our parents were never too harsh on us, even though they didn't like that and thought we would go to hell if they discovered us out there. Avoid trying to see what was whistling. I live in a funny neighborhood. I've loved living here since I was 6 years old. The homes are modest but well-maintained, with spacious yards and lots of open space. I turned 13 in October, so there are a lot of kids my age here. In the summer, we would wander from back porch to back porch or play foursquare in the cul-de-sac where we grew up. I'm old enough to see that this was a terrific place to grow up, and the night whistling and the good fortune are the only two peculiar things present. I was never very affected by the whistling. As I already mentioned, I was unable to hear it from my bedroom, but I've stopped asking questions because my parents don't want to discuss it. My father is tall, composed, and a powerful man. Since he immigrated to the U.S. as a child, he had an accent. My grandfather and his family are from the islands. They refer to it as that. The whistler is the single thing that makes my dad lose his composure. Then he speaks a little more quickly, his eyes move more quickly, and he reminds us not to think too much about it, and to always keep in mind the big rule, which is to avoid trying to peek outside when the whistler passes. Even if we wanted to, we couldn't look. Every window has shutters on the interior, which are heavy, thick pieces of canvas that latch to the bottom of the window frame and pull down from the top. Even a little lock, roughly the size of a journal, is attached to each latch. Before we all go to bed each night, my dad locks the shutters and stores the key in his room. My mother, what she thinks about the whistling is unknown to me. I could see her if I cracked my door open just a bit to get a glimpse. I've seen her out in the living room before when the noise begins at 3:03:03 dot. She doesn't go out very often, at least I haven't seen her very often, but I believe she sits outside on our large red couch once or twice a month to simply listen. Every night, the whistler plays the same tune. It's jovial. Da-da-da-da-da-dum, da-da-da-da-da-dum. As I mentioned earlier, there are two peculiar aspects of my residence. Everyone in my neighborhood is really fortunate, save from our night whistler. Good things seem to happen to folks around here a lot, though it's difficult to describe and Dad doesn't like it when we talk about it. Usually it's little things like winning a radio competition, receiving an unexpected promotion at work, or discovering some real arrowheads buried in the yard. There is no crime, the weather is generally pleasant, and everyone's gardens are particularly vibrant in the fall. I've heard my mother describe living here as a million little blessings. However, my sister Nola is the primary reason we remained here, and the reason we initially relocated here. She had a lung issue at birth, which made her very ill. When she was born, we were only allowed to visit her at the hospital. We were not even allowed to take her home. I recall how tiny she was, especially in relation to the other infants. For her, a machine had to breathe. In order to be nearer to the hospital, we moved into this house. Nola began to improve as soon as we relocated here. We could all see that the physicians were perplexed, but they were unable to solve the problem and blamed it on whatever they were doing. However, my mom and I also understood that Nola's recovery was only one of the many small benefits that come with living in our neighborhood. That's why we stayed even after learning that, despite the daily tiny miracles that occur here, occasionally horrible things do happen. However, they only occur if you seek out the whistler. You see, there is a welcoming committee in our neighborhood. Every time someone new moves in, they arrive with a manila folder, macaroni casserole, and a gift basket. They're really amiable. When we moved in 7 years ago, there were 4 people. The committee held Nola alternately, chatted, and offered me a Snickers bar. They were especially cautious because it was her first week out of the hospital. I was then sent to my room, where I could still hear almost every word, when the committee requested to speak with my parents privately. My parents were informed by the welcoming committee that the area was incredibly pleasant, in a difficult-to-describe way. Subsequently, they informed my parents about the much more difficult-to-describe whistling that began at 3:03 every morning and stopped at 3:05. As long as we didn't check for the source of the sound, the group, together, warned my parents that the whistling was harmless and would never injure us. They emphasized this bit, so I strained to hear them by pushing my ear against the door. The luck of those who went in search of the whistler changed, sometimes in a tragic way. Anyone looking would see a black cloud hanging over them. If something could go wrong, it would. Newspaper clippings, articles concerning auto accidents and lives lost, public fatalities, and strange mishaps were all included in the manila package the committee brought over. The committee's head told my dad not everyone dies. However, they lose their vitality. Even if they survive, they will never again have light or presence. I could tell my mother wasn't paying much attention to it. She kept asking if they were pulling a practical joke on their new neighbors. My mom once became irate and questioned the committee if they were racist because my dad was from the islands, accusing them of attempting to scare us out of our new house. My dad soothed her by telling her that he could tell our new neighbors were serious and genuinely wanted to assist us. He clarified that he knew there were weird things that lived among us because he grew up hearing stories like these from his mother. Most of those odd things were just unusual, albeit some were wonderful and some were bad. Following the committee's departure, Dad went to the hardware shop, purchased canvas blinds, latches, and locks, and after supper placed them on all of the windows in the house. When I sneaked out of my room at 3 a.m. on the first night we moved into our new home, I discovered my dad sitting on the couch in the living room, holding my little sister. My dad tapped the couch beside him while making a shh motion with his finger. We waited while I sat. The whistling was heard at precisely 3:03. Da-da-da-da-da-dum, da-da-da-da-da-dum. It arrived and proceeded exactly as our neighbors had predicted. Every night, the whistling returns. But we choose to ignore it and continue to be grateful for our daily, million tiny blessings. Nola is a strong, intelligent child who can breathe on her own. My father even became a member of the welcoming committee. Why would anyone want to move out when we don't often get new neighbors? However, my dad and the committee bring the manila folder, a gift basket, and macaroni casserole to a new family when they move in. When my dad returns, I can always tell by the expression on his face whether the family took the committee seriously or if we'll soon be having new neighbors. A family recently moved in right next to us. Ms. Maddie, the previous owner, died at the age of 105. She has had a long and happy life. It seems like our new neighbors would blend right in. Since they had a small child of their own, they followed my dad's advice on the shutters being locked and believed the welcoming committee. My dad never allowed us to examine the evidence or newspaper clippings that were in the manila folder. But given that our neighbors got along well for the first month, I suppose it must have been really convincing. Our new neighbors sent their son Holden to stay with us one evening when they had to leave town. He was 12 years old and a year younger than me. Even though I didn't know him well before that evening, I could tell it was going to be a rough night as soon as his parents dropped him off after supper. Who do you think is out there every night whistling? As soon as the grown-ups had left the room, Holden asked, A Disney film was playing quietly on the TV, while the three of us sat in the den. My sister and I looked at each other. "We don't discuss that," I stated. Holden remarked, "I think it's that weirdo who lives in the big yellow house on the corner." "Mr. Tolles?" inquired my sister. "Nope, he's a really good guy." Holden gave a shrug. "So, must be a psycho killer." Nola stiffened. I reiterated, "We don't talk about it. Let's play Nintendo in my room." We played games, ate popcorn, and watched movies for the next few hours. It was just another sleepover, but I could see Holden was growing restless. Holden got out of his beanbag and moved to where Nola and I were sitting on my bed after my parents had said goodnight, locked the blinds, and gone to bed. He questioned, "Have you ever even tried looking?" Like most sleepovers, we had conveniently disregarded any idea of a bedtime. "It's almost time." To my surprise, he was correct. It was nearly 3 in the morning. I let out a sigh. "We don't." He ignored me and went on, "See, I can't even try to look because my dad hides the key and locks the blinds every night." "Our dad does too," Nola remarked. "No," Holden answered. "No, he doesn't." I said, a bit harsher than I intended, "You saw him do it." Holden smiled. "Yes, your father locks the blinds, but he does not conceal the key. He wears it on his regular keychain." Concerned that I already knew what he would say next, I said, "So?" Because after all these years, I had noticed that my dad no longer bothered to hide the key. He understood we were serious about it. "I went to the bathroom after your dad locked up, but before your folks went to bed. I might have gone to borrow the key to the blinds after snooping around their room on my way and spotting your dad's keychain on his nightstand." As Nola and I gazed, his smile just got bigger. "I told you that you were lying." Holden gave a shrug. "If you'd like, you can check. His keychain is on the nightstand right there if you open your parents' door and look." I said to them both, "Stay here. Avoid making any movements." I ran to my parents' room, but I was hesitant at the door. My father would be upset if Holden wasn't lying. I'm furious. I felt frightened when I considered it. However, I'm more afraid of an open window with the Whistler nearby. I barely cracked the door, but it was too dark to see what was within. I inhaled deeply before entering the room. I froze 2 steps into the darkness. The whistling began, and from my parents' room, I could hear it perfectly. They must have heard the sound every night since we moved into the house, but I was unaware of it. We were never informed. I doubt that I would have been able to sleep through it. Unsure whether to yell for my dad or turn on a light, I stood there and listened to the whistling get closer. I was jolted back to consciousness by the soft sounds coming from the living room. I shouted, "Nola!" and hurried from my parents' room. Holden and Nola were standing by a window by the entrance door. Holden told the truth. He was struggling with one of the blind's locks, and I could see it. There was a click. The key was in his possession. Holden laughed a little. Fearful but perhaps intrigued, Nola crouched next him. The whistling had moved directly outside our house. However, I turned us so that Nola was looking away from the window while I held her in my arms. I closed my eyes at the same moment. The blinds snapped open. The whistling ceased. Nola was trembling in my arms. "Please don't look," I informed her. "Avoid turning around." We were arranged such that I was facing the window and she was facing back towards the hallway. I had not opened my eyes. She nodded into my shoulder, and I felt it. I attempted to touch Holden with the arm that was not holding Nola. His arm was touched by my hand. He was more trembling than Nola. "Holden?" I inquired. "With it." With my eyes still closed, I carefully groped for the window as I reached past him. My fingers felt cold against the glass. It was cooler than it should have been for the season. I reached up the window and felt for the blind's rope. The farther I reached, the warmer the glass got, and a soft hum reverberated back into my fingertips. I made an effort not to consider what might be outside the window. At last, I pulled the shades closed and touched the string. I opened my eyes. I could see Holden, little and pale, peering at the now closed window in the faint light that was leaking out of the kitchen. "Holden?" I repeated. He yelled as he turned to face me. It was all a blur of movement. The hall and subsequently the living room were illuminated. The hardwood floor clattered with the footfall of my parents. I kept my eyes fixed on Holden and didn't even glance back at them. He was pale and had wet himself after biting his lip so forcefully that a faint red line of blood ran down his chin. My father asked me from behind what happened. I was able to turn away from Holden and turn around. He took a look. That night, I witnessed my dad's fear for the first time, an ancient, unsightly fear sewn into his face, the fear of a parent. He mouthed, "Just Holden," to me. "Yes," I nodded. My father exhaled deeply. I almost thought he would cheer since he looked so relieved. However, my dad's expression changed when he turned to address Holden. I pondered whether he felt guilty about how pleased he was that Holden was the only one who looked. A knock on the door was heard. Everybody froze. Holden let out a whine. My mother said, "Don't respond to it." She was standing at the hall's entrance. We were all believers that night, even though I had always assumed she was a skeptic and had only made fun of my dad for the windows and the whistler. My parents were holding baseball bats, which I assumed they had gotten from their bedroom. The knock was heard again, a bit more loudly. Holden muttered, "Please, don't open the door." My father approached him and gave him a tight hug. My father, still holding his bat, said, "We won't." This evening, nothing is coming in here. Thud, thud, thud. The knocking was loud enough to shake the door this time. Nola put her arms around my neck as Holden wailed once more. My mother approached and knelt beside us, holding my sister and me close. Fud, fud, fud. My mother said to my father, "Call the police." Immediately, the knocking ceased. My father glanced at us over his shoulder. "Do you believe?" Frantic knocking interrupted him, followed by a courteous tap, tap, tap. Something on the other side of the door said, "Police." The external voice was a parrot, repeating the words back to my mother, and it sounded just like her. "Police, call the cops, tap, 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 police." My mother drew us in. The phrase "police, police, police." "Please stop," she whispered to me. My dad said, "I don't think calling them will help. How can we be certain that they are the ones at the door?" The knocking returned with more force. The door shook. It then came to a halt. After a while, I heard the knocking once more, but this time it came from our back door. Together, we turned to face the back door, but the knocking instantly went back to the front door. Loud, then quiet, then loud again, front to back to front. All of a sudden, the sound was coming from both doors simultaneously, with large sledgehammer-like strikes. Then, there was a rapping sound coming from every window in the home, followed by the walls. It felt as though a dozen individuals were attempting to play simultaneously within a drum. Or perhaps something was trying to pry us from our shell and we were a turtle. "Stop!" shouted Holden. The knocking stopped. Holden stared at the door and murmured, "I won't tell." I swear I won't share what I witnessed with anyone. Please, just leave." Almost a minute passed while we waited. Then, from the window Holden had previously examined, we heard a gentle tap, tap, tap. Like a prisoner watching a gallows being erected outside their cell, Holden began to cry. My father held him and combed his hair, but he never told him that everything would be all right, or lied to him. For the remainder of the night, there was constant tapping at the window. For an indeterminate amount of time, we congregated in the living room. After a while, my dad stayed to guard the door as my mom attempted to bring kids into my room. However, the knocking returned as soon as we entered my bedroom, loud enough to be ignored. I feared the door would not withstand it. The knocking ceased when we returned to the living room. There was nothing left but the tap, tap, tap on the window. That night, none of us slept. About 7 in the morning, the tapping ceased. The sun rises here around that hour. After 2 more hours of waiting, my dad finally pulled the blinds from one window. First, he ordered us all to return to my parents' bedroom. He opened the door and returned. And I heard it. "All right," he said, "it's finished." It was about midday when Holden's parents returned. Holden was escorted to his home by my parents, and they all spent some time inside. I looked out the window with Nola. She stayed by my side the entire day, occasionally holding my hand. Despite their somber appearance, my parents refused to share their conversations with Holden's family with us. We all spent the day together, ordering pizza and watching movies because it was a Sunday. Everyone stayed in my room that night, including my dad, in a chair he had moved over, and Nola and my mother in the bed with me. That night, and every night after, there was no knocking. For the remainder of that week, we didn't see Holden or his parents very often, but on Thursday, a moving truck pulled into their driveway. After school, Nola and I spent the entire afternoon watching them pack stuff. The thing that most strikes me is how exhausted Holden and his parents appeared. Their eyes were lightless, and their mouths were stern and pallorous. I could see something was seriously wrong even from the other side of the street. Before dusk, Holden and his family had left. When my parents and I first moved in, I recall what the initial welcoming committee told them. Even though not everyone who glances at the Whistler dies, those who do lose their spark and live a life filled with tragedy, a million minor misfortunes. Holden's parents must have looked, in my opinion, either to share the load if they believed in him or to console him if they didn't. Sometimes when I see Nola looking contented, youthful, and vibrant, I wonder if I would have been slower, and if she had looked out the window that evening, would I have done the same? To console her, to divide that load. I'm relieved that I won't have to learn. We still reside in that neighborhood and in that house. Every night we can still hear our Whistler passing by. The luck, blessings, and positive aspects of this place are too great to leave. However, we exercise caution. We no longer invite friends around for the night. And my dad is really good at hiding the blinds key. I haven't gone looking. Oh, there are some things you simply don't need to search for.